This week for baking, the yeasted breads I decided to make were an onion, garlic, and mixed herb focaccia, as well as 2 types of pretzels. Some regular salted pretzels, as well as cinnamon and sugar. Now let's go! So starting with the pretzels, I used 1.5 cups of warm water, tablespoon of sugar, 2 teaspoons of kosher salt, 2¼ teaspoons of active dry yeast, and 22 ounces of flour. To activate the yeast, I added 1 tablespoon of sugar to warm water and then I sprinkled the yeast in. I was too lazy to get something to stir the water with, so I just used my hands. And yes, I did wash them afterwards. Anyways, I set that aside for about 12 minutes and let the yeast grub on that sugar until it was all bubbly and active. Ooh. When those 12 minutes have passed, I proceeded to add my wet ingredients to the 22 ounces of flour along with the 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. I started to mix that with my hands until most of the flour was incorporated into a bigger, shaggier ball of dough. Now for the fun part! I apparently like to make things harder for myself, so I began to knead my dough for a whopping 10 minutes. If you have a KitchenAid and a dough hook attachment, by all means necessary, I urge you to use that. But because I was in the mood to hand knead, I decided to do so. And I am still sore as I record the voiceover for this video. When my dough was kneaded properly and was nice and smooth, I finished it off by rounding it into a ball by pushing the dough away from my body and then using the surface tension to bring the dough back to my body with my hands. This method creates a smoother exterior for the dough and creates a skin. When my dough baby was nice and smooth, I let it rest in an oiled bowl and let it proof in my oven for about 1 hour and 30 minutes. Make sure your oven is off, by the way. When the dough has doubled in size, I deflated it to release the carbon dioxide. I set that aside for a little and I filled a pot with some water and added 3/4 cup of baking soda and waited for it to come to a boil. On to my favorite portion, not really, of the pretzel process, shaping. Honestly, I don't know how y'all do it at Wetzel's or Auntie Anne's, I don't know. Anyways, but here I am in my feeble attempt to shape. I begin by rolling out a piece of dough that I portioned into a long rope shape and then creating like a U, like the letter. And I take both ends of the dough, twist twice in the middle, and bring the ends to the bottom center and pinch so both ends are secure. I also had some little pretzel bites because honestly, they're superior to whole pretzels. I am definitely not a pro at this, but I think they came out not too shabby. When all of the pretzels were shaped, my water was boiling, so I proceeded to add the pretzels to the baking soda-y water. Let the pretzels sit in the boiling water for about 30 seconds to a minute and transfer onto a Silpat-lined baking tray to be egg washed. Add your eggy pretzels to an oven preheated to 450 degrees Fahrenheit and bake for about 12 to 15 minutes or until nicely brown. When your pretzels are still hot, brush those babies with some melted butter and dip into your cinnamon and sugar mixture. For the other plain salted pretzels, I just sprinkled with coarse salt. There you have it. Pretzels are some of my favorite things ever, so this is a recipe I keep near to my heart and my arteries. Now it's time to make some focaccia. I am sorry to any Italians listening. Anyways, this bread takes some time to make, so I definitely recommend preparing everything, including your mise en place, the day before. I also cut this recipe down by fourths because I was not trying to make 11 pounds of dough because bread makes you fat.
That makes you fat?
So starting with the Biga, the ingredients are 170 grams of bread flour, 95 grams of room temperature water, and 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. I then mixed the Biga in a plastic container until everything was incorporated and all of the dough was off the sides. After that was done, I let it sit for about 24 hours. And that's why it's important to get everything ready the day before and make sure you have the time to make your bread. Cutting to the next day, and my Biga has grown nicely, and you can see all the bubbles and how it's spread out. So now for the ingredients for the main dough. We have 567 grams of bread flour, 3.5 grams of yeast, 423 grams of water, your 265 grams of Biga, 45 grams of olive oil. Here I'm using garlic oil. Well, 15 grams of salt and some more oil that we'll need later. So to prepare the dough, I added the yeast to the flour and just mixed it with my hands. Moving to my stand mixer, I added water, the Biga, olive oil, and salt, and then the dry ingredients. I mixed that on low for about 4 minutes with my, oh look, dough hook. This is what my dough looked like after 4 minutes of mixing. Loose and ready to bulk ferment. I let that sit for about 45 minutes, and then after those 45 minutes were up, I began to fold the dough over itself very gently to build the structure of the gluten. I folded the dough over itself about 4 times, and then let it ferment for another 45 minutes. I have not been making bread for a long time, so this is the part where you get to see me scramble, dividing my dough, and very sloppily shaping it into rounds. I definitely need a lot more practice, and I truly admire anybody who can shape bread in like 10 seconds. Working with the first half of dough that I divided, I transferred it to a silpat-lined baking tray, brushed it with some of that garlic oil, and began to gently press down on the dough with my fingers and stretched it out to about a 10-inch circle, trying to keep the dough as even as possible. When that was done, I just repeated those same steps on the other loaf. Hi, Meg editing here. I just realized that I said a silpat instead of parchment paper. That's wrong. Well, not really wrong. Anyways, yeah, correction. Parchment paper. Yeah. When the loaves were stretched out, I let them proof in my oven that is off for about 45 minutes. While I was waiting for my bread to proof, I just chopped up some fresh herbs and sauteed some onions for the topping. When my bread was proofed and sprung back when I poked it, it's time to move on to the toppings. I began this process by indenting the dough with my fingertips in a sporadic random pattern. I then randomly scattered my desired toppings. If I were to do anything different in this process, I would probably scatter my onions and fresh garlic on the bread halfway through the bake so they wouldn't burn. Anyways, after my toppings were all on the focaccia for both of the loaves, I drizzled some more olive oil and sprinkled some coarse salt. This particular recipe calls for a deck oven and steam, and unfortunately I do not have a fancy oven, so we gotta improvise. I boiled some water and then I poured it into a loaf pan to put in my oven. I also splashed some water into my oven that was preheated to 460 degrees Fahrenheit. When my oven was prepared and ready to go, I baked the focaccia one at a time for about 25 to 30 minutes or until it was golden brown and hollow. For the last 10 minutes of the baking, I took out the steam bath and let the bread finish baking. And there you have it, some lovely focaccia. Focaccia. I'm not an Italian nonna, but I will say this is probably the best bread I've baked in a while. I was practically foaming at the mouth just smelling this bake in the oven. It was so flavorful, and utilizing fresh herbs really elevated the taste. If I didn't cut the recipe down and made the 11 pounds of dough, I dang near would have eaten it all by myself. Anyways, thanks for tuning into my quarantine bread making. Making bread is actually incredibly therapeutic, especially in this interesting time. Hopefully this encourages you to make your own loaves at home. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you guys next time.